In the remote limestone country of south-central Kentucky, where the earth is riddled with thousands of caves and sinkholes, where underground rivers carve passages through rock that has existed since before humanity walked the earth, there exists a cave system that locals have avoided for over 120 years. A place that official maps label simply as closed to public access, with no explanation for why this particular network of passages has been sealed with concrete and steel barriers that seem designed not to keep people out, but to keep something in. In the winter of 1897, when a local landowner discovered a previously unknown entrance to what appeared to be a vast unexplored section of the cave system, when a group of experienced miners agreed to enter these passages to assess their potential for valuable mineral deposits, no one could have predicted that 12 men would enter the earth and only 3 would emerge. Their minds so shattered by what they had experienced that they would spend their remaining years in asylums, screaming about things that medical science had no framework to understand. What happened in those limestone passages during 3 weeks in February and March of 1897 remains officially unexplained. A mystery that has generated theories ranging from toxic gas exposure to psychological breakdown to encounters with something that should not exist. This is the story of the Carter Cave Expedition, of 12 men who descended into darkness seeking fortune and found something that destroyed their sanity, of 9 bodies that were never recovered despite extensive search efforts, and of mysteries that continue to haunt Kentucky to this day, mysteries that suggest some places in the earth were never meant to be explored by human beings. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this is your first time on our channel, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. The cave systems of Kentucky have been known for centuries, first explored by Native Americans who used them for shelter and ceremony, later mapped more extensively by European settlers in the 1700s and 1890s. By the 1890s, commercial cave tourism had become popular, with Mammoth Cave already attracting thousands of visitors annually who marveled at the vast underground chambers and strange rock formations. The economic potential of caves extended beyond tourism. Many contained deposits of saltpeter used in gunpowder production, others held limestone suitable for building material, and there were persistent rumors of caves containing precious metals or gems. It was this potential for mineral wealth that motivated Thomas Carter, a landowner in Hart County, to investigate a collapse that had occurred on his property in December 1896. A sinkhole that had opened during heavy rains and revealed what appeared to be an entrance to a previously unknown cave passage. Carter, who owned 240 acres of rough limestone country that was marginally suitable for farming, but potentially valuable if mineral deposits could be found, hired a local guide named Jacob Hess to make a preliminary exploration of this new opening. Hess, who had spent 20 years guiding tourists through local caves and had explored dozens of smaller cave systems, descended into the opening in January 1897 with basic equipment and spent about 3 hours mapping what he could reach. He reported back to Carter that the cave system appeared extensive, with multiple passages leading deeper into the earth than he had been able to safely explore alone, and that he had seen formations suggesting the presence of minerals that might be commercially valuable. Based on this initial report, Carter decided to organize a more thorough exploration, hiring a team of 12 men who had mining experience and offering them shares in any valuable deposits that might be discovered. The 12 men who agreed to join the Carter Cave Expedition in February 1897 were all experienced in underground work, though none had worked specifically in Kentucky caves. 6 were coal miners from eastern Kentucky, accustomed to working in dark, confined spaces and familiar with the dangers of cave-ins and gas pockets. 3 were hard rock miners from Tennessee with experience in copper and iron mining, skilled in assessing mineral deposits and comfortable with the physical demands of underground labor. Two were local men who had worked as cave guides and knew the general characteristics of Kentucky limestone caves. The 12th man was Jacob Hess himself, serving as the expedition's leader based on his preliminary exploration. The equipment they carried included oil lamps, rope, picks and hammers for sampling rock, basic surveying tools for mapping the passages, and enough provisions for what they estimated would be a 2-week expedition. They entered the cave system on February 18, 1897, carrying their equipment in canvas packs, confident in their abilities and excited about the possibility of making a significant mineral discovery. The first week of the expedition proceeded according to plan, with the team exploring and mapping the main passages accessible from the entrance, taking rock samples, and gradually working their way deeper into the cave system. They had established a base camp about 300 feet from the entrance where they stored supplies and equipment, and they had set up a system of colored markers to help navigate back through the complex network of passages. By February 25th, they had explored roughly 2 miles of passages and had descended to an estimated depth of 600 feet below the surface. The rock samples they had collected showed traces of various minerals, including lead and zinc, though nothing in concentrations that appeared commercially viable. It was on February 26, according to later testimony from the 3 survivors, that the expedition discovered what they called the cathedral, a massive chamber unlike anything any of them had seen in years of underground work. The chamber was roughly circular, approximately 200 feet in diameter, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of their lamps, and most unusually, it contained what appeared to be man-made structures. These structures were described as stone pillars or columns arranged in concentric circles, each pillar roughly 8 feet tall and carved with symbols that none of the men recognized. Symbols that seemed to represent neither Native American markings nor anything from European or American tradition. The discovery of these pillars should have been exciting, evidence of some unknown historical presence in the caves that might attract scholarly or tourist interest even if minerals proved disappointing. Instead, the structures created a profound unease among the expedition members. Several of the men expressed immediate discomfort with the space, describing feelings of being watched, of wrongness that they couldn't rationally explain, of an instinctive desire to leave the chamber immediately. Jacob Hess, as expedition leader, made the decision to set up camp in the cathedral chamber while they documented the pillars and decided whether to continue exploring passages that led deeper from this location. This decision would prove catastrophically wrong. The first night camped in the cathedral chamber passed without obvious incident, though the 3 survivors later reported that none of the 12 men slept well, that their dreams had been disturbed by visions of figures moving in the darkness beyond their lamplight, of sounds that seemed to come from impossibly deep within the earth, of a sense that something vast and ancient was aware of their presence. The next morning, February 27th, the team began a more systematic examination of the pillars and the chamber itself. One of the miners, a man named Robert Sullivan, used a small hammer to carefully chip away a sample from one of the pillars, hoping to determine what type of stone had been used and perhaps date its construction. What happened next was described by survivors as impossible but undeniable. As Sullivan's hammer struck the pillar, a sound emerged from the stone. Not the expected crack of breaking rock, but something that resembled a low note from an enormous musical instrument, a tone so deep that it was felt in the chest and bones more than heard through the ears. This sound continued for nearly 30 seconds after Sullivan stepped back from the pillar, and it was accompanied by a vibration that ran through the entire chamber, causing small rock fragments to fall from the invisible ceiling high above. More disturbing than the sound itself was the effect it had on the men's perception of the space around them. Multiple expedition members reported that while the sound continued, the chamber seemed to expand, the walls appearing to recede into impossible distances, the ceiling opening to reveal what looked like stars or lights moving in patterns that hurt to observe directly, the stone pillars seeming to grow taller and multiply until there appeared to be hundreds of them extending in all directions. When the sound finally ceased, the chamber returned to its previous dimensions, but several of the men were visibly shaken, and an argument broke out about whether the expedition should immediately abandon the cave or continue exploration. Jacob Hess, perhaps driven by his role as leader and his obligation to Thomas Carter, made the decision to continue for at least another few days, though he agreed that they would no longer camp in the cathedral chamber, instead returning to their original base camp closer to the entrance. This compromise satisfied most of the team members, though 3 of the miners expressed strong opinions that the entire expedition should be abandoned immediately, that whatever had happened in the cathedral chamber was a warning that should be heeded. Over the following days, from February 28 to March 3, the expedition continued exploring passages that branched off from the cathedral chamber, though their work was increasingly hampered by growing psychological distress among team members. Men reported seeing movement in passages they had just mapped as empty, hearing voices calling their names from deeper in the cave system, experiencing sudden attacks of vertigo or disorientation that made navigation difficult. The oil lamps began behaving strangely, their flames turning colors that oil lamps shouldn't produce, blue and green, and occasionally a deep purple that created shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. 2 of the expedition members, both coal miners from eastern Kentucky, disappeared on March 3 during what should have been a routine exploration of a side passage. The rest of the team, conducting a frantic search, found the passage the missing men had entered, but found no trace of them beyond about 200 feet into the tunnel, where their footprints simply ended, as if they had been lifted off the ground or had walked into something that left no trace. The passage itself extended another 100 feet before terminating in a solid rock wall, with no side passages or openings where the men could have gone. Their lamps, rope, and some of their tools were found arranged in a precise line on the cave floor at the point where their tracks ended, an arrangement that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental dropping. This disappearance created panic among the remaining 10 men, and a heated argument broke out about whether to continue searching or to immediately abandon the cave. While this argument was ongoing, a third man, one of the cave guides who had local knowledge of Kentucky caves, suffered what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown. He began screaming that the pillars were moving, that the cathedral chamber was following them through the passages, that something was counting them, taking them one by one. He had to be physically restrained by other expedition members, and could not be calmed, his screaming continuing until his voice gave out, and he collapsed into a state of trembling silence. The decision was made to immediately evacuate the cave, carrying the incapacitated guide and abandoning most of their equipment and supplies. 9 men remained capable of movement. The guide who had broken down was carried by 2 others, and Jacob Hess led the group back toward the entrance using the colored markers they had placed during their inward journey. But the markers, which had been carefully placed and systematically arranged, now seemed wrong, appearing in places the men didn't remember marking, arranged in patterns that didn't match their records, occasionally leading to passages that the expedition members were certain they had never explored. The journey back toward the entrance, which should have taken no more than a few hours based on their outward mapping, stretched into days. The men became increasingly disoriented, finding themselves repeatedly in the cathedral chamber despite deliberately trying to avoid it, encountering passages that seemed to change configuration each time they entered them. experiencing time distortion where what felt like hours of walking resulted in their lamps burning down only minutes worth of oil. 3 more men disappeared during this nightmarish attempted exit. 2 simply vanishing when the group passed through a narrow section of passage where they had to proceed single file. The men ahead and behind the vanished individuals reporting that one moment they were there, and the next they simply weren't, with no sound or sign of struggle. The third man who disappeared during the exit attempt was seen by multiple witnesses to walk deliberately into a side passage despite shouts from other team members to stop, ignoring their calls as if he couldn't hear them or was compelled by something beyond his control. When other expedition members immediately followed him into the passage, they found it empty, with no trace of where he could have gone in the few seconds between his entering and their pursuit. By March 6, 5 men remained from the original expedition of 12, all of them showing signs of severe psychological distress, dehydration, and exhaustion. They had lost all confidence in their maps and markers, had abandoned most of their remaining equipment to move faster, and were operating on the edge of complete panic. It was at this point, according to the 3 who would eventually emerge, that they encountered the descending passage, a section of the cave they had no memory of passing on their inward journey, a steeply sloping tunnel that seemed to extend downward at an angle that should not be possible given their current depth. The 5 men could not agree on whether to follow this passage, which seemed to lead in the general direction they believed would take them toward the surface, or to avoid it and continue searching for a route they recognized. While they were debating, one of the men, driven by exhaustion or desperation or possibly the same compulsion that had driven the previous men to walk into side passages, started down the descending tunnel despite protests from the others. After a moment of hesitation, 2 of the remaining men followed him, while the final 2, including Jacob Hess, refused to enter that passage and instead continued searching for an alternate route. These final 2 men, Hess and a miner named William Garrett, emerged from the cave on March 11th, 21 days after the expedition had entered, both in a state of severe dehydration and near total mental breakdown. They were found by a search party that Thomas Carter had organized after the expedition failed to return at the expected time. Stumbling out of the cave entrance in broad daylight, their clothes torn, their hands bloodied from crawling through passages, their eyes unable to adjust to sunlight after so long in darkness. Neither man could provide a coherent account of what had happened. Hess kept repeating that the cathedral was counting, that the pillars moved when not directly observed, that the cave went down forever and they never should have entered. Garrett, even less coherent, claimed that they had been followed by something that walked without walking, that existed in spaces between spaces, that had been selecting them one by one according to rules they couldn't understand. The third survivor emerged 6 days later, on March 17th, having taken a completely different route through the cave system and arriving at an entrance nearly 2 miles from where the expedition had originally entered. This man, one of the Tennessee hard rock miners named Samuel Drake, was in even worse condition than the first 2 survivors, having apparently been without food or water for multiple days. He was initially unable to speak due to severe dehydration, and when he recovered enough to provide testimony, his account matched the other survivors on basic facts but differed dramatically in details, suggesting either that the 3 men had become separated earlier than they claimed, or that their perceptions of events within the cave had been so distorted that they literally experienced different realities. Drake claimed that he had watched the other 2 men who entered the descending passage disappear into what he described as folding darkness, a section of passage that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, where space itself appeared to bend in ways that caused physical pain to observe. He claimed he had spent days, possibly weeks, wandering alone through passages that changed configuration, where his lamp stayed lit despite having no oil remaining. where he encountered structures similar to the pillars in the cathedral chamber, but made of different materials, including what appeared to be glass or crystal that showed images inside. Scenes of the missing men trapped in spaces that didn't follow normal laws of physics. Drake's account was initially dismissed as the delusions of a man driven mad by isolation and fear. But details in his description of the alternate entrance he had emerged from matched geological features that no one outside of professional geologists studying the area should have known, suggesting that at least some elements of his experience were grounded in reality. All 3 survivors were committed to asylums within months of their emergence from the caves, none ever recovering enough to live independently or provide substantially more useful testimony than their initial statements. Hess died in 1899 at age 43, Garrett in 1902 at age 38, and Drake in 1905 at age 41, all of them decades before they should have succumbed to old age, all of them maintaining until their deaths that something in the cave system had marked them, was still aware of them, and would eventually reclaim them. The search for the 9 missing men began immediately after the first survivors emerged, with multiple rescue parties entering the cave system in March and April of 1897. These parties, consisting of experienced cave explorers and miners, were able to locate the cathedral chamber that the expedition had described, confirming its existence and the presence of the mysterious Oin Beim Bellers Einkar Washow Pullers and a road show Hungers. They found some of the expedition's abandoned equipment and supplies at various points in the passages, confirming the basic route the expedition had taken. But they found no trace of the 9 missing men. No bodies, no evidence of where they might have gone or what might have happened to them. What the rescue parties did report, in language that was remarkably consistent across multiple independent groups, was a profound sense of wrongness in the deeper sections of the cave, a feeling that they were being observed or followed, instances of equipment malfunction, and perceptual distortion, similar to what the expedition had experienced. Several rescue workers reported seeing movement in their peripheral vision that vanished when directly observed, hearing sounds that seemed to come from impossible sources, experiencing attacks of vertigo and disorientation in specific areas of the cave system. 2 separate rescue parties refused to continue after reaching the cathedral chamber, their members unanimously agreeing that proceeding deeper would be dangerous for reasons they couldn't articulate. By May 1897, the official search for the missing men was abandoned, with authorities concluding that they had died somewhere in the unexplored depths of the cave system, and that their bodies might never be recovered. Thomas Carter, facing potential legal liability for having organized the expedition, closed the entrance to the cave and sold his property at a significant loss to a buyer who agreed to keep the cave sealed. Over the following decades, the entrance was reinforced multiple times, first with wooden barriers, later with concrete, and finally in 1952 with steel grates embedded in concrete and secured with locks. Official geological surveys. Map. The general area of the Carter Cave system, but provide no detailed information about the passages within, and the site is posted with signs indicating that entry is prohibited due to structural instability, though locals whisper that the real reason involves the unsolved mysteries of what happened to those 9 men, and what might still exist in the deeper passages. In the decade since 1897, there have been periodic reports related to the Carter Cave system that suggest the mystery remains active and unresolved. In 1923, 2 teenage boys who managed to penetrate the barriers and enter the cave were found 3 days later in a state of severe psychological distress. claiming they had seen carved pillars that moved and rearranged themselves when not directly observed. In 1956, a geological research team that entered the cave system with official permission to conduct a survey emerged after only 6 hours, refusing to continue their work and filing a report that described anomalous readings on their equipment and a unanimous decision among team members that the cave should remain sealed. In 1978, a group of experienced cave explorers illegally entered the system and became lost for 2 days before finding an exit, later describing navigational impossibilities and encountering structures that should not exist in a natural cave formation. What makes the Carter Cave mystery particularly disturbing is the consistency of accounts across more than a century, the recurring themes of stone pillars or structures, spatial distortion and navigational impossibility, of a sense of presence or awareness that seems to emanate from the cave itself, of people disappearing or being selected according to rules that observers cannot understand. Skeptics have proposed various rational explanations for the original 1897 incident and the subsequent reports: toxic gas pockets that cause hallucinations and disorientation, illusions created by unusual rock formations, and flickering lamplight, psychological effects of isolation and darkness, group panic that spreads through suggested contagion. These explanations can account for some elements of the reports, but they struggle to explain the physical disappearance of 9 men whose bodies were never found, despite extensive searches. The consistent descriptions of impossible architecture across independent witnesses separated by decades, or the specific similarities between what the 1897 expedition reported and what later visitors have described. Geologists who have studied the region note that the limestone cave systems in this part of Kentucky are among the most extensive in North America, with passages that can extend for miles and reach depths of over 1,000 feet below the surface. They acknowledge that large sections of these cave systems remain unexplored and that new passages continue to be discovered regularly. They cannot, however, explain the structures that multiple witnesses have described in the Carter Cave system, structures that appear deliberately constructed, but that show no evidence of known Native American or European origin, structures made from materials and using techniques that seem inconsistent with any historical period. In recent years, advances in remote sensing technology have allowed researchers to create partial maps of the Carter Cave system without physically entering it, using ground-penetrating radar and seismic imaging to trace the major passages. These maps confirm the existence of a very large chamber at approximately the depth where the 1897 expedition reported finding the cathedral, a chamber that shows unusual acoustic properties and what appear to be regular vertical structures that could correspond to the reported pillars. But these remote sensing techniques cannot provide the detail necessary to determine the nature of these structures or explain what happened to the missing men. And proposals to mount modern expeditions with advanced safety equipment and technology have been repeatedly denied by authorities who maintain that the cave should remain sealed for public safety reasons. The families of the 9 men who disappeared in 1897 never received definitive answers about their relatives' fates. Most eventually held memorial services without bodies and moved on with their lives as best they could, though several family members spent decades pressing authorities to continue searching or to allow independent expeditions. Letters and journals from these family members, preserved in local historical societies, reveal the profound impact of having a loved one simply vanish without explanation. The inability to achieve closure when there is no body to bury and no clear understanding of what happened. Some of these family members became convinced that the missing men were still alive somewhere in the cave system, trapped in passages that rescuers couldn't reach, a belief that seems irrational given the length of time that passed but that reflects the psychological difficulty of accepting a disappearance without evidence of death. The 3 survivors of the expedition, during their years in asylums before their deaths, occasionally provided additional fragments of information about their experiences in the cave, though these accounts were often contradictory and influenced by their deteriorating mental states. Jacob Hess, in lucid moments, drew maps of passages he claimed to have traveled through. Maps that showed geometric impossibilities, passages that looped back on themselves in ways that would require existing in 4 spatial dimensions. Chambers stacked vertically in configurations that couldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. William Garrett became fixated on the idea that the pillars in the cathedral chamber were marking or recording something, that the symbols carved on them were counting or measuring in units that human mathematics couldn't comprehend, that each person who entered the cave was being assessed according to criteria that had nothing to do with any human system of value or meaning. Samuel Drake, the last to emerge and the longest surviving, maintained until his death that he had been allowed to leave. That something in the cave had evaluated him and determined he wasn't what it was looking for, that the 9 men who disappeared had been taken deliberately for reasons he couldn't understand but that terrified him more than death itself would have. Modern psychological analysis of the survivors' accounts suggests they were suffering from severe trauma, possibly combined with oxygen deprivation, dehydration, and the psychological effects of isolation and darkness. But this analysis cannot explain the specific and consistent details that all 3 men provided, despite having been separated for most of their time in the cave. Details about the structures they encountered, the spatial distortions they experienced, and the sense of intelligent selection in the pattern of disappearances. If this story revealed something you never knew about the mysteries that lurk in unexplored places beneath our feet, leave a comment telling us what surprised you most. And if you want more untold stories of mysteries that remain unsolved, of places where the rules of reality seem to operate differently than we expect, of the dangers that can lurk in the darkness below the surface, subscribe. These stories matter not just as history, but as reminders that there are still places in our world that we do not fully understand, spaces where human beings venture at their peril, and mysteries that may never be solved because the answers exist in realms beyond our normal comprehension. They thought the Carter Cave System was just another Kentucky limestone cave, a geological formation that could be mapped and explored, and potentially exploited for commercial value. But what 12 men discovered in those passages in 1897 suggested that some places are not meant for human exploration, that the Earth holds spaces that operate according to rules we don't understand, and that the line between the physical world we inhabit and something else, something that exists in the darkness beneath our feet, may be thinner than we imagine. And in the sealed entrances to that cave system, in the barriers that have been reinforced and strengthened over more than a century, in the official warnings and the unofficial stories that keep people away from those passages, there remains a mystery that has haunted Kentucky for over 120 years. A mystery about 9 men who entered the earth and never returned, about structures that should not exist in a natural cave, about a place where space itself seems to fold in ways that defy our understanding of physics, and about the possibility that some of humanity's oldest fears, of the dark, of the underground, of spaces that exist beyond the reach of sunlight, might be based not on superstition, but on encounters with realities we are better off leaving undisturbed.